Well, welcome everybody. My name is Nick Childs. I'm the Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security here at the IISS. So I'd like to welcome to Arundel House all those who are with us here in the room, but also to the audience joining us on Zoom for this discussion meeting on Russia and the Arctic Maritime Challenge. The Arctic in the high north is, of course, of growing interest and has been for some time. The dynamics of it between cooperation and competition has been in flux for a considerable period. But of course, we've had the shadow of the Ukraine war, which has significantly increased perceptions of the region as one of heightened strategic risk. And however the conflict unfolds from here on in, the ramifications for the region will likely only grow, at least in terms of how they affect Russia and how Russia affects them. So to discuss all this, I'm very pleased to welcome to the IISS two speakers who have been good friends of the Institute for a considerable amount of time and whose expertise in the relevant issues to hand here, I for one have the highest regard, and we also have a collection of expertise in the room as well. So so I know the speakers are keen on having a good discussion, but how we'll proceed is as we normally do, which is that each of them will make opening remarks, and then we'll have a discussion period in which I'll invite the interventions from the floor here in the room and on Zoom by way of the Q&A function. So so do please be prepared to get engaged in the discussion. As I said, I have the highest regard for the speakers that we have today. On my immediate left, Dr. Rebecca Pincus, formerly of the US Naval War College, but now director of the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, and next to her, Professor Mike Peterson, who's the founding director of the Russia Maritime Studies Institute at the US Naval War College. So that's certainly enough from me. So I'm going to hand over straight away to Rebecca to kick off our discussions.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Thank you for the invitation to speak here. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. I'm really excited to get to our Q&A, given some of the outstanding experts we have in the room, and looking forward to your comments and questions. So I'm just going to start with offering a few remarks at the top. And I want to open with a quick story. So I'm at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. now, which is a nonpartisan policy think tank, but I've only been there about 9 months. And prior to that, I was working in the Pentagon in the office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. And I was the working lead for the U.S. National Strategy for the Arctic region. So I was representing DoD in the sort of writing of the strategy at the working level before we started sending it up through all the levels of authority. And we were working on the strategy, and we were almost done in January 2022. And then we had to stop and pull down what was really a completed draft that was going through, I think it was at 2 or 3 star level reviews at that point. So we immediately yanked it back and spent several months rewriting it. And that was a really painful process. I will say the strategy was finally released last October. So it was probably about 8 or 9 months of watching what was happening in Ukraine and looking at the language we had in this strategy, which is a 10-year strategy, and trying to think carefully about the implications and the effects of the further invasion of Ukraine by Russia on the Arctic region. And it took a lot of consultations, and I think I'm very happy to have the NSAR, the National Strategy for the Arctic region, out now, and I think it lays out a great path forward for the U.S. in the Arctic region. And, you know, it does state clearly that the U.S. seeks an Arctic that is stable, peaceful, prosperous, and cooperative. And right now, there is not space to cooperate with Russia, given its ongoing and brutal invasion of Ukraine. And there's a really interesting conversation to be had about what the future looks like and what the pathways are towards resumed cooperation. What needs to happen? What conditions need to be met? And what do those various pathways look like? I'm very happy to be in the UK all week to engage in a variety of conversations around what the future looks like for the Arctic region, because I think the UK is a key partner. While not an Arctic state, it's got significant Arctic capabilities, equities, and interests. And so I'll be really looking forward to hearing what you all think about this. Because I think we have really seen a turning point. And, to go back even further, I've been working for the US government. I was working for the Navy and the Coast Guard before that on Arctic issues dating back for about a decade now. And so I'll say that in engaging with our Russian counterparts, for many years, we had hoped that positive incentives would yield improved behavior. And the table seemed laid in the Arctic for it to be an ideal area for sort of cooperation with the West and positive incentives. Because if you look at Russia's position in the Arctic, obviously they're the largest Arctic state by geography, by population. About 50% of the Arctic coastline is Russian. And Russia, as essentially a petrostate, as a state that's economy is reliant upon the export of largely hydrocarbons, also some minerals and other grain, I believe. Most of its as yet untapped resource deposits lie in the Russian Arctic. Its resources in southern latitudes that are easier to tap have already been accessed. And so Russia's economic future lies in the Arctic. It's got massive deposits of oil and gas, coal, minerals and metals stretching across the Russian Arctic. It's got 3 massive northwards draining rivers, the Yenisei, the Lena, the Ob, probably butchered pronunciation. I apologize to all the Russian speakers in the room. And its vision for the 21st century was really to develop the northern shipping route across its Arctic coastline and use revenue from that shipping route to help support the development of its hydrocarbons, its minerals and metals, its forests, and to ship goods out of the Arctic, east to Asia, west to Europe. And that would really be the engine, the economic engine that would support its economy and its state throughout the century. So the Russian Arctic is of tremendous importance to the state, and it's really an economic center. That development was and still is reliant on foreign capital and foreign technology. Now, following the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014 and the imposition of Western sanctions, much of the capital and technology from the West dried up. We saw a pretty sharp pivot in 2015 eastwards. Russia went searching for capital to China, to India, Japan, Vietnam, throughout Asia, and was able to continue some of those development projects, although they were a little bit hobbled. And that was a really interesting pivot. That's when talk of the Polar Silk Road started occurring, right? Tying China's Belt and Road Initiative to the Arctic. We saw a really close deepening of that Putin and Xi bromance, some people call it. But even then, there was still, I think, some hope that the Arctic would remain stable and cooperative, because in just the last few years, we saw some pretty significant achievements in Russian Arctic governance and cooperation. So Russia assumed the chair of the Arctic Council back in 2021. They took that chair from Iceland, and there was great hope that the chairmanship, the Russian chairmanship of the Arctic Council would be a moment of opportunity when they would want to showcase cooperation and stability in the Arctic. That, of course, didn't happen. But, even a couple of years ago in 2021, we could point to the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. Russia was a leading partner in the negotiation and writing of the CAO agreement, which put a moratorium on Arctic fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean for 16 years. They were also a leading partner in the negotiation of the agreement on scientific cooperation in the Arctic. So the US and Russia worked together very closely on that agreement, which is signed by all 8 Arctic states, and that's to facilitate science across the Arctic region. So they were participating in Arctic governance, and they were also following the rules of the CLCS, the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, in making their claims to Arctic extended continental shelf in the Central Arctic Ocean there. There were obviously some areas of concern. There's great concern about environmental issues in Russia. But, last year, I would say the further invasion of Ukraine really changed quite a bit of that trajectory. So while Russia is still in many ways reliant on its Arctic resources, many of those projects have slowed down or been paused. And there are question marks surrounding the future of some of the bigger ones. So we're still seeing a lot of LNG, for example, come out of the big Arctic projects. The Yamal Peninsula hosts an enormous LNG plant owned by Gazprom. There's also the Arctic LNG 2 yard from Novatek. Those are producing a lot of LNG. Much of it is going east to Asia now, but other activity in the Russian Arctic has slowed down. So, for example, last year in 2022, we saw no foreign shipments across the Northern Sea route. And so that's an indication that foreign economic activity is really dropping. There were just 34 million tons of shipping across the NSR last year, which is really just a drop in the bucket when we think about sort of global shipping activity, and even President Putin's goal of getting to 100 million tons by next year. Clearly, we're not gonna hit that. And so the economic activity has slowed down significantly. We see Russian, the big corporations active up there, looking for capital in China. We can talk about that. The trajectory of Russia-China cooperation is really interesting trajectory. Also India, India is purchasing quite a bit of hydrocarbons from Russia right now. And so watching the future of that partnership, I think will be very, very interesting. Last year, following the invasion, the 7 Arctic states, excluding Russia, put a pause on the work of the Arctic Council, and that was unprecedented. The Arctic Council is the sort of high-level forum for governance in the Arctic region. It's a consensus-based platform. So without Russian agreement, obviously there was a limit to the changes that could be enacted, but the other Arctic 7 put a pause on activity. Russia went ahead with its chair program by itself. And that pause went on for about 6 months. Late last year, work resumed in the Arctic Council working groups on projects that didn't have Russian involvement. And that sort of truce held until May of this year, when the chairmanship passed from Russia to Norway. That transfer happened smoothly, which is really, I would say, a positive sign for, there's some seats right up here, if you'd like. For cooperation. It was mostly an online event. There's very little publicity, but the chair passed, and Norway has made it very, very clear that they intend to spend their chairmanship of the Arctic Council stabilizing the Arctic Council and shoring it up as an institution. U.S. strategy also makes it really clear that they see the Arctic Council as the preeminent forum for Arctic governance and will work to sustain it going forwards in the future as well. I'll say there's an ongoing debate right now about how cooperation in the Arctic Council might begin to include Russians again. And there's interesting questions there. Obviously, the Arctic Council is working on top priorities that are shared around the Arctic, and that's on issues like black carbon. Work had been going on a black carbon agreement for quite a while. It's an advanced project. Not including Russia is very difficult. Work on Arctic plastics. Plastic pollution in the Arctic is really important. Obviously, implementing the fisheries agreement, conducting the science in the Central Arctic Ocean, implementing the scientific cooperation agreement. There's a lot of interesting work that right now is not possible. It can't go forward while including Russians, and there's an interesting balance to strike between how we pursue our objectives in the Arctic region vis-a-vis some of these environmental goals, and how we continue to draw a firm line in the sand against Russian aggression in Ukraine. Other impacts of the war, I would say, so we've talked about, NSR shipping is down. There's question marks about the future of Russian economic development in the Arctic. We've talked about the Arctic Council and the future of governance in the region. Another really interesting piece is looking at sort of the two states that have boundaries with Russia in the Arctic, and that would be Norway and the United States, maritime boundaries, I should clarify. Norway and Russia have, a long maritime boundary where, there's LNG there, there's fish there. They've got a really long-standing and sort of tight-knit relationship. And so Norway has been striking a very careful balance and doing a lot of very sophisticated diplomacy, I would say, over the last year or so. Also in the United States, the US and Russia share a maritime boundary in the Bering. There's very rich fisheries there in the Bering. And so the US Coast Guard is one of the very few points of contact that's still working between the US government and the Russian government. Norway has been taking steps to pull back Russian access to its fishing waters. And so in their last fisheries agreement, they're still exchanging quotas and they still permit Russian fishing in their fishing grounds, but they have restricted the ability of Russian fishing vessels to access Norwegian ports. So Russian fishing vessels are now just allowed in the 3 ports of Tromsø, Kirkenes, and Batsford. And they have a limited set of activities that they can engage in there. So crew changes, fueling, unloading fish, and provisioning, but they're no longer allowed to do repairs and maintenance. And that's because of concerns in Norway and also, I would say, throughout the Arctic about the potential for Russian fishing vessels to engage in hybrid or sort of gray zone activities. Some of that is certainly linked to the war in Ukraine, but also we saw the cutting of a fiber optic cable between Svalbard and the Norwegian mainland back in January 2022 that there have been some reports that point to the presence of Russian fishing vessels at the time that the cable was severed. There's also been some efforts to reduce Russian fishing presence around Greenland and the Faroe Islands, which are also major areas of activity for the Russian fishing fleet. But I would say when we think about sort of the major challenges right now, or sort of the buckets of risk on the sort of non-military side, I'll leave the military side to Mike. There's this question around Arctic governance, and I'll be really interested to hear your questions and comments on that when we get to the discussion piece. There's also, I would say, a big question around environmental risk, and that's something that I think about quite a bit. We know that Russia is plowing ahead with development projects in its far north. It's doing so on a shoestring, right? So last year, Rosatom called for permitting Arctic LNG tankers with no ice class certification to utilize the Northern Sea Route. So they're reducing their environmental standards as a cost-cutting measure, we can assume. Letting non-ice class vessels carrying hydrocarbons transit through the Russian Arctic is alarming. The conditions are still very, very hazardous. They're extremely unpredictable. We saw a large flotilla of merchant ships get trapped in the Eastern Arctic in 2021 when ice came in unpredictably. And I'm very concerned about the prospect of lax environmental standards on hydrocarbons in the Russian Arctic, because whether those hydrocarbons, whether it's LNG or oil, is coming west to Europe or east to Asia, if there is some kind of accident, the currents in the western part of the Arctic will carry oil into US waters towards Alaska. In the eastern part of the Arctic, obviously Norway is very concerned about a spill. Again, there's big fisheries there. So when we think about environmental development, also you can think about the Nor-Nickel pipeline rupture in the Russian Arctic just a few years ago, which has been attributed to permafrost thaw. That's a major problem across all of Russia's north. Some 60% of its infrastructure in the far north is threatened by permafrost thaw. And there's thousands of miles of pipelines, railways, airfields. Some of the costs of infrastructure repair and protective measures in the Russian Arctic have been estimated as, I think it's about $120, $150 billion. There's a tremendous permafrost risk to Russian infrastructure. They've recently enacted a law calling for the establishment of a system of monitoring stations across the Russian Arctic to monitor permafrost and methane emissions. But again, in the current climate, we don't know what's happening inside Russia. If there was some kind of major environmental disaster, I don't know that we would get information out, that it would be trustworthy, that there'd be any sort of independent verification. And so that's a concern for all kinds of environmental disasters. Obviously, hydrocarbons, pipelines we worry about, nuclear disasters, right? Russia has a high fail rate on their military side. So there's the risk there. But also, we've got a grouping of decommissioned nuclear reactors from submarines sitting on the floor of the Kara Sea that dates back to Soviet days. We know those reactors are rusting out. Norway and other European states have been working closely with Russia to lift them up and seal them. All of those measures are obviously on pause right now. And so that's something that I know Norway is very concerned about. Russia is pushing out floating nuclear reactors, small nuclear reactors into the Arctic as a source of power. There's one in Dixon now, and they're building additional. So, that's another source of concern. And so I think the environmental piece is something that I worry about quite a bit, given the rapidly changing climate there. And then I guess the last major bucket of risk that I would highlight would be sort of the hybrid gray zone piece, right? So thinking about the Russian fleet, thinking about critical subsea infrastructure, thinking about Svalbard. Obviously, there's a lot of hyperbole around sort of Svalbard being the next Crimea, and I think that's really overblown, but there are some concerns there. It's a very sensitive point. And so I think that's an area of concern when we think about sort of the gray zone. And obviously the accession of Finland and soon Sweden into NATO means that the Arctic is now divided between 7 NATO states and Russia. And that changes the overall dynamic. I think it raises tension quite significantly. I don't want to start touching on security issues because those are for Mike, but hopefully I've outlined sort of the changes and the impact of the war and some of the current challenges and concerns that we're talking about quite a bit in Washington. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So thanks so much.
Rebecca, thanks very much, and thanks for providing the political and economic and importantly at the end the environmental element to the overall kind of framework and architecture, and an interesting, the mantra of everyone is keeping the Arctic low tension. That's the ambition, but and it's interesting your point about the impulse to try and find ways to re-engage Russia in this area, but the context of that looks very difficult at the moment, and also this issue of what is the Northern Sea route? What does it mean in terms of both leverage and friction points going forward? But thanks for that. And as you hinted, now over to Mike, perhaps to get down to a bit more of the nuts and bolts on the kind of naval, maritime, and military aspects of all of this. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you everyone for being here, and thanks to everyone online. I am Mike Peterson, and I had nothing whatsoever to do with the U.S. Arctic strategy. So I'm going to talk about a couple of hopefully related but possibly unrelated items that we can kind of throw out to the group, both online and here, and hopefully will generate a little bit of discussion. One of the things that has concerned me about discussions of Russian military capability, capacity, and strategy, and the Russian military generally in the Arctic, is that assessments, to my mind, have been deeply overinflated about what Russia will and will not do in the Arctic, what it can and cannot do. And I think a little sobriety is in order. It's not to say that Russia is 4 feet tall, but they're also not 10 feet tall. Prior to the Ukraine war, we were seeing, especially between, say, 2014 and 15 and roughly 2020, 21, we were seeing a lot of assessments of the Russian military that concluded that Russia would use the Arctic as a jumping off point to close the Norwegian Sea or to close down the English Channel, and that was always suspicious to me, and I don't think that's true. And I think that we've got some pretty good evidence to say that it is not these days, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. But what I'd like to do is sort of start very, very basically by framing this conversation in Russian military strategy and Russian military concepts, and then move forward from there. So Russian military strategy is based on a mixture of offense, counteroffense, and defense. It's not purely defensive, despite what a lot of Russians say. It's cast that way. It's not purely offensive, despite what a lot of people in the West, and particularly in the US, like to say, in the US think tank community. And it is not necessarily about Russia reaching out in the Arctic and dominating the entirety of the Arctic and owning all of the Arctic's resources and keeping everyone out in perpetuity. It's much more complicated than that. So when we think about military strategy, I think it's important to remember that we should think about it in terms of both of three things: defense, counteroffense, and offense. An intellectual starting point for the Russians is that, of course, all of their military strategy is indeed defensive at the strategic level. That's a common theme that you'll hear in Russian statements about what they are attempting to do with their military and what they want to do, especially in the Arctic. That the military is inherently built for defensive purposes, but that doesn't account for operational warfighting concepts, strategic operational warfighting concepts that demand preemption, or what the Russians might call prevention, what Valery Gerasimov has called prevention, that demand offensive operations in order to, at the operational level of war, in order to achieve what may be strategically defensive goals. So the offense is baked into the cake in Russian military strategy, but it is much more complicated than just whether or not the Russians are going to immediately conduct a strategic offensive to go out and seize territory or take over resources or what have you. Even in a strategically defensive war, even what is cast as a strategically defensive war, offense matters. If we think about the Ukraine war, right? Russian leadership cast the war as a strategically defensive operation. Well, we know that that's obviously hogwash, but at the same time, internally, I think if we are being strategically empathetic, we have to understand that there is an internal logic to Russian leadership's pronouncements about that, and that to them, that might be true. It's just one example, I think, even though it's not true, it's just one example, I think, of how they may think about it. So I think that's maybe a good starting point for understanding some Russian Arctic military issues, especially for offshore resources in the Arctic. The military's mission is explicit, and that is to protect economic resources, period, in the Arctic. Obviously, there is a strategic nuclear deterrent mission. I'm sure most of the people in this room know that well. That's been done to death. That's a very clear mission as well. But what I would argue is that what has been sort of achieving, or what has been gaining more priority in Russian military thinking over the last decade or so, particularly in naval thinking, is the protection of offshore resources. A lot of those resources that Becca had mentioned before. Where the economic resources are, so goes the military and so goes the Navy. That's been very clear, I think, in a lot of pronouncements. Russia's maritime doctrine and naval doctrine all make this very clear. It is a very specifically outlined task in these official documents signed by the president himself. You can navigate to the Russian Ministry of Defense website and see a list of objectives in peacetime for the Russian Navy. And the vast majority of that list of objectives is dominated by protecting Russian maritime economic interests, whether that's in the littorals or in the exclusive economic zone, or even in what they would call the world ocean globally. In some cases, the Navy actually is the leading edge of economic trade deals, or of trade deals and other economic developments around the world. But that's the story for a different time. The newest maritime doctrine, Russian maritime doctrine, highlights the Arctic as what they call a vital region. And that means actually that they're giving the area, the Arctic, a higher priority even than the Black Sea. In this maritime doctrine, the Black Sea has a lower priority than the Arctic, despite a war being waged. That doctrine was published in 2022, after, of course, the war began. But what I think is more interesting than just deeming that area a vital area is what the definition of a vital area is in the Russian lexicon. And the vital area is one that, as the Russians put it, is essential to the survival of the Russian state. And for those of us who know what that means in terms of military strategy, I think you can make that leap. But what that means for military strategy is that they are willing to defend that area with, if necessary, nuclear power. Russia has made very clear in their own national security doctrine that anything that puts the survival of the state at risk will be defended with nuclear weapons. And so that means that while I'm not arguing that Russia will use nuclear weapons in the event of a foreign danger to the Arctic, that means that at least the option will be held out. I don't think that Russia immediately goes to use of nuclear weapons right away. I think I've got some excellent colleagues who have done some great work on that. It's very clear that Russia will not rely on using nuclear weapons first before exhausting conventional options. But it does mean that nuclear weapons are on the table for defending the Arctic. That's what I would argue. At the same time, I think some sobriety is also in order with regard to Russian military power assessments in the Arctic. I'm sure many people here in this audience are aware of the development of the various cloverleaf bases that Russia has put up in the Arctic over the last several years, the sort of modernization of Russian capabilities that has taken place. On the first point about those bases, I think it's worth remembering just how remote they are. They are way out on the end of a very long logistics line. They're entirely isolated. And yes, they are vital, I think, to Russian security, especially for the purposes of early warning. But they're way out on a long logistics line, badly exposed. And the resources that are required for maintaining those bases are actually quite high. There are rumors, in fact, that Russia has trouble finding people who will go out and be willing to be stationed at those bases. And if they are stationed out there, there are rumors that they're being forced to stay when they want to leave after their tour. So it's very difficult, you can imagine, to keep military personnel at those bases. So they're very distant, they're very remote. Yes, they might be used for offensive purposes, but not as permanent stationing bases. That's one thing I think to keep in mind. Most of Russia's bomber force is a strategic bomber force is based farther inland in interior areas of the country. And those bases are again, they are quite limited for the purposes of staging large scale strategic bombing missions. I will say that I think, on the other hand, some specificity regarding Russia's Arctic zone is also necessary. The Arctic is huge. It's a massive place. So when we talk about the Arctic, especially in military terms, and I'll come around to the specifics of this in a moment. When we talk about the Arctic in military terms, what I would ask is, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about the Barents Sea or the Laptev Sea? Are we talking about the Bering Sea, or are we talking about the Kara Sea? These things matter for, especially the specificity matters, especially for the reasons that I've been kind of outlining, like where are Russian sensitivities? Where will Russia really take notice if a foreign country begins to operate there openly, or then Russia detects that? Deterrence issues in the Arctic are quite sensitive, and this is why I ask for more specificity with regard to discussions in the Arctic. There's a great amount of enthusiasm for a FONOP in the Arctic in the United States, and I also know that that's true in the UK. Well, the question is, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about a regular naval mission in international waters in the Barents Sea, which is perfectly legal, although sensitive to the Russians? It's perfectly legal. Are we talking about a freedom of navigation operation all the way through the Northern Sea Route, which is far more risky, including navigating through, say, the Kara Gate, which is icebound for I don't know how many months of the year? Or are we talking about an operation in the Bering Sea? What specifically are we talking about? A FONOP isn't a naval operation in the Barents Sea is not always a FONOP. And I think it's worth keeping that in mind and how that gets cast. A couple of years ago, there was a mission, for example, the British and the US ran up in the Barents Sea. Someone in the United States Naval Forces made the mistake of saying that's a FONOP. And then the Russians displayed on the map where all the ships had gone because they were watching it very closely. And it was very clear it was not a FONOP. But that has certain foreign policy implications. And I think that kind of specificity, I think, is important. So the geographic specificity is important. And then the issue of deterrence, I think, and how that ties together also matters. Last point on deterrence, and then I'll stop. I think that these operations are useful, and I think that they're important. I think the United States and the UK and NATO should be operating in the Arctic, in the maritime Arctic. I think that's vital, and we can all do so legally without. We should be able to do so legally without any threat military threat from Russia. On the other hand, coordinating those operations across NATO or with other U.S. or bilateral missions is critical. We had a discussion earlier this week about Russian red lines. I don't believe that any single one, there are a few, but it's not useful to think about red lines when you think about Russian operations with operations against Russia. It's more useful to think about an accumulation of operations that get to the point where Russia decides this is too much. Now we have to do something about it. So an accumulation of operations may trip certain sensitivities is maybe a more useful way to think about it. And if we are running, call them FONOPs if you want, or specific maritime security operations in the Barents Sea, while we are also flying, for example, B-1 bombers around the periphery of Europe, while we are also trying to push US or UK naval ships into the Black Sea, for example, in the wake of the fall of the collapse of the grain deal. Those are the kinds of items I think that will matter, right? So it's an accumulation of issues that matter with regard to the Russian Arctic and operations in the Russian Arctic rather than any one issue. Again, there are some sensitivities there, but we can get into that. I think I should stop there. I've gone on long enough. We should leave some time for discussion, and I'll turn it back over to you, Nick.
Thanks both for that, and absolutely, I'm sure we'll pick up on the deterrence question because that's a critical area, I think. But it is time for the discussion. We've got about 20-25 minutes for that. For those in the room who'd like to make an intervention, please make yourselves known in the traditional way and be prepared to identify yourselves as well. And given the timing, also, I will go straight to questions rather than take the privilege of the chair, at least for now. There are some questions already in the Q&A box on Zoom, and we'll come to those first. But I will recognise, first of all, Jamie Shea, Dr. Jamie Shea.
Nick, thank you very much. Jamie Shea, qualifications for being here, friend of Nick. Which is good enough. Thank you.
Yes, it is.
A lot. If I may, a question briefly to each of you. To Rebecca, could you say something more about how China and Russia are cooperating or not cooperating in terms of the Northern Sea route and Arctic more generally? I mean, China obviously has an interest, at least in terms of its future trade, in keeping that route open. Is it investing, or is it leaving that to Russia and being content to use it? Is it exploiting Russia's need for China in the current Ukraine context, therefore concessions? I'd be very interested in any comments on that. And Mike, a quick one to you. You saw at NATO's Green Summit last week that a regional plan now has been adopted by NATO for the North. Obviously, it's not just the maritime component, but do you think that, at least in terms of NATO's strategic interests at the moment, it's important for the alliance to be more visible up there? You mentioned exercises, freedom of navigation. Would that be unnecessarily provocative towards Russia? Has NATO got it about right? And if the US is obviously going to have to sort of deploy more in the Indo-Pacific in the next couple of years, is it looking not just for the UK, but for other European navies to step up? Denmark, Netherlands, etc., when it comes to the Arctic. So those are my two questions. Nick, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Before you respond, I'll bring in Nicholas Granholm as well, and also reinforce the point that I think the speakers were inviting comments as well as questions. So bear that in mind. But Nicholas,
thank you. A very good presentation. Thank you to both of you. One thing that I would be interested in from the record to say is that the Arctic Council has had a look at the past 18 months or so. What you could also see is, does that also go for the other organizations? I'm thinking about the Arctic Coast Guard Forum and, to Michael, the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable. And then for there's also something called the Protection Against Oil Spill Agreement that was also enacted upon. Is that defunct, or might it still work? Last question, which is wider, that's the issue of science diplomacy in the Arctic. I mean, it's taken a hit here, obviously, but it was something that was used in the Cold War to keep dialogue going and sometimes convey messages and all that. Is there some discussion on possibility of using that as a way forward? Thank you.
Would like to go first.
I'm happy to.
Becca?
Great questions. Thank you. I'm so glad we have time for a robust conversation now. When it comes to Chinese and Russian cooperation in the Arctic, in the NSR, I think it's too early to tell. We're watching that space. So, prior to the sort of further invasion of Ukraine, we saw that there was increasing Chinese investment in Russian Arctic projects, but there was a lot more sort of excitement than actual tangible deals negotiated. So, we saw great statements and handshakes, Putin and Xi shaking hands, the Polar Silk Road, tremendous excitement. But a lot of the actual negotiations broke down because there's a lot of natural friction in that relationship. Russia's Arctic resources are its crown jewels. So Russia wanted to maintain majority stakes in any project. Russia is not a great business partner. And we've seen the history of Russian hydrocarbon development. Many companies have been burned. So Chinese investors also wanted majority stakes, so they would have the upper hand. And so they failed to reach agreement in many cases. Chinese investment vehicles took about 30% stake in the Yamal LNG mega project. There's, I think, 3 separate stakes of about 10% each. That was a really big signature investment. And obviously, China has struck very big, massive gas deals, not Arctic specific, but big gas deals with Russia over the last, 6 or 8 years. So those investments have gone forward, but since last year, we have not seen really significant new investments. Most Chinese major companies and banks are abiding by the secondary sanctions. The smaller Chinese entities have gone forward with Russian investments. So we're seeing sort of a mostly holding the line out of fear of secondary sanctions. Obviously, China's still purchasing quite a bit of oil and gas from Russia. And when it comes to the NSR specifically, prior to 2022, COSCO, the Chinese shipper, had been shipping through the Russian Arctic. They didn't send any ships through the NSR last year. So I think that's a really interesting indication of where that relationship is going. Because we see these sort of contradictory messages. We've seen Chinese and Russian naval exercises, Arctic adjacent exercises in the last year, but then you don't see any COSCO shipping. So I think there's so much attention being paid to the Chinese-Russian trajectory. And I think the Arctic is a really big piece of that. It's something that it's too soon to tell what's going to happen there, but it's a really tremendous question. If we start seeing more Chinese investment flow into the region, shipping return to the NSR, I think that'd be a really troubling indication, quite frankly. And obviously, there's great concerns that if Russian dependence on Chinese capital becomes if they become over leveraged, then China will be able to extract concessions that may be very adverse to Western interests. So I think that space is very important to watch. When it comes to Nicholas's question about sort of the other Arctic fora, the invasion has really stopped cooperation or paused, I think, all of them. So, the Coast Guard Forum, Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, even things like the Barents Euro-Arctic EAC, what's the C? It's the Commission, I think that's been paused, or it's Council. Yeah, I don't think they're working with Russia anymore. And some of this, I think the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable hadn't included Russia since 2014, and the Arctic Chods had also been in pause since 2014. But the Coast Guard Forum had been working with the Russians until last year. I think they're still working through the 7 modality, the not including Russia, the Marine Oil Spill Prevention Agreement, so the MOSPA agreement and the SAR agreement, in addition to the Scientific Cooperation Agreement and the CAO, are some of the big Arctic agreements facilitated by the Arctic Council and signed in the last decade. And I think implementation of all of them is, from my understanding, does not include Russia right now. I think that pause extends across all of those agreements. And it's, these agreements were all struck in the last decade because they recognize that Arctic states have shared interests in preventing and responding to maritime oil spills, search and rescue incidents, scientific cooperation. And so they're all sort of, the future of those is on hold. And I think that points to the larger question about science diplomacy. Russia is the largest Arctic state. And, right now, it's clear that we cannot cooperate with them under current circumstances. That lack of the shutdown and cooperation is having, adverse consequences that we are all happy and willing to bear right now out of recognition of what's going on in Ukraine. But I think there is, when we look out to the future, the longer this pause and shutdown goes on, sort of the magnitude of the adverse impacts to areas like science diplomacy and some of these other shared interests. And so I think that's where there's really difficult conversations going on around, what are the requirements for restarting? What conditions must be met? What would happen then? How would this, what would this look like? And I'd add another dimension I didn't get to in my remarks about Arctic indigenous peoples. They're very concerned about the shutdown right now. In the Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia, there are family groups that are now unable to contact each other. Russia has a permanent participant at the Arctic Council, so an organization that represents the indigenous groups of the Arctic, RIPON, the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, and it's been co-opted by the Russian government, which has now installed its own leadership, right? And so even when cooperation resumes, what is that going to look like with RIPON, which last year came out with a statement endorsing the invasion, so there's going to be these ripple effects throughout all of Arctic governance that I think are really challenging. So thank you for raising that issue.
I'll be quick. So Becca already answered your question,
Sorry.
Nick, about Nicholas, about the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable. But just moving over to the other questions about NATO's visibility in the Arctic and other nations stepping in. I do think that's vital for lots of different reasons, not just deterrence, but for also alliance unity purposes and for partner reassurance. There is a significant debate in the U.S. About how much resources, what amount of resources should the U.S. be putting into Europe vis-a-vis preparing for some potential future conflict with Taiwan. I have my own concerns about the latter issue. I will say that right now it appears that the United States is deeply committed and will remain deeply committed to European security, at least for the time being. Having said that, I do think that it would be vital for other nations to step in and be prepared to conduct more deterrent activities, defined by whatever the sort of national and multinational interests those activities would be limited by. So, what do I mean by that? When we talk about deterrence in the Arctic, everyone always says, well, we have to go up and we have to deter Russia in the Arctic. Well, my first question is, what the hell are we deterring them from? And someone inevitably pounds their fist on the desk and they say, from dominating the Arctic. Well, I don't know what that means either. So really, if we're talking about deterring Russia from creeping advances into areas of contested claims, sure, okay, that's a good specific answer. If we're talking about keeping Russia from attempts at intimidating its neighbors, they have flown bomber and fighter missions against Stockholm. They've done so against Vardo. They've done so against other sites in Norway. I think those are great missions. And I think that just exercising the general ability recognized by international law to sail in international waters in the Barents Sea is perfectly fine. And I think the Russians also accept that to some degree. They know that they can't stop NATO nations from operating in some of those areas. In the central Arctic, that's a very different question. But by and large, I think the answer is yes. NATO should. Other NATO nations can and should be more involved as a way to not necessarily just to deter, but also to signal alliance unity, to reassure partners that yes, the alliance is strong, and that it's then there's the specific tactical issues that go along with operating up there. Well, the experience of operating in the Arctic is very different from operating anywhere else on planet Earth, so it's, I think, vital to gain some of that tactical experience as well.
Thanks very much. We've got quite a few questions in the Q&A space, but also some here in the room. I'll just pick up some from our Zoom audience. One of which is from Omar Uzbek, who raises the question about UNCLOS and whether the situation in the Arctic would push the US to ratify UNCLOS. I mean, that's a bigger question, I think, but I just wonder what your thoughts are on how the Arctic might or might not figure in that. Another question also regarding the US, and that is from Burke Vindenvogel. He puts it to you, Mike, in the sense that you raised the issue around the Arctic is more than one area, but his question is, what does that mean specifically for the US Navy, and which is the highest priority areas? And I don't know if you want to take that one or Becca take it on board. But anyway, there are a couple of questions there, and then I know Dimitri wants to make an intervention, perhaps. Do you want to? Oh, okay.
Yeah, so Dimitri Gorenberg from CNA. This is probably mostly for Mike. So on the one hand, you have you've described the Arctic as a vital area for Russia as they picture it. On the other hand, it's quite remote and quite expensive to maintain military forces. So I'm asking you a little bit to sort of forecast the future, but what do you see, given the possibility of resource constraints going forward, where do you see that balance falling out? Are they going to continue to invest resources in military forces within the Arctic? Do you see a bit of a retrenchment? What areas are priority areas? Or a little bit of a speculative question.
Thanks.
And I'll take one more from in the room, Damien Terrell.
Damien Terrell, maybe. So thank you very much for raising any really important points. You mentioned a series of particularly aggravating factors in the Arctic region. Something I'm particularly interested in is the ideological significance of the Arctic region to the Russian national psyche and how it might be impacted, particularly given current events in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much. So UNCLOS, priorities for the US in which parts of the Arctic, trajectory of Russian investment in the Arctic, and where Russia the Arctic sits in Russian ideology. Mike, do you want to go first this time?
Sure. Yeah. I'll let Becca take the UNCLOS question. But I will talk about this idea of yeah, you get the hard one. And you're the one that you'll get in trouble for if you get it wrong. But I will take the question about multiple areas in the Barents or in the Arctic in general. I think for the United States is primarily concerned with those areas of the Arctic that may serve as nuclear bastions. Now, I underplayed that in my initial comments, but I want to be clear that that is still an extraordinarily strategically vital and sensitive area, not just for the Russians, but also for the United States. And I think it's not only is there a nuclear issue involved, especially in the Western Arctic and the Barents Sea, there's this issue of allied and partner reassurance. The U.S. relationship with Norway is very strong and very tight, and now, of course, it has been with Sweden and Finland, but now even more so. And I think it's vital that the United States, I know that the United States views its relationship with those countries in the high north as extremely vital. I will say this is more speculative, but from just a warfighting perspective, those areas, including Finland, Sweden, and northern Norway and Iceland, are, I would argue, at risk of theater level strikes from Russian joint forces in the unlikely event a war were to break out. So it also matters from a U.S. perspective to maintain that sort of tactical acuity to operating in those areas as well. So I would also say that, of course, on the eastern side of the Arctic, the Bering Strait, in the region between, I guess it's the Chukchi Sea, right, and the region between Siberia or eastern Russia and the Russian Far East and Alaska is also quite vital. Just again, from a purely territorial perspective, but that's more. It's not so much. Yes, there are maritime issues involved there. Becca is more familiar with those than I am, but there's also just sort of this is where we see a lot of more than anything else, we see Russian Air Force incursions into the U.S. Air Defense Identification Zone there. Okay, I'll be really quick. Constraints in the Arctic. Thanks, Dimitri. It's a great question, and one I suspect you have very strong feelings about as well. So thank you for asking me. It's nice that you do that. I would say, first of all, that Russian resources, military resources in the Arctic have not suffered in the Ukraine war the way other resources have, except for Russian ground troops. Ground troops based in the Arctic have been transferred to Ukraine and gotten chewed up like every other ground piece of the Russian army. But Russian naval forces, Russian long-range aviation have been largely untouched, except for those the cost of the resources that they've invested in terms of maintenance and in terms of weapons, long-range munitions in particular. So I think that Russia is likely to sort of maintain as best they can this trajectory. I don't see any revolutionary changes in Russian military strategy, and I think that means I don't see any changes in Russian military priorities in terms of expending resources on the Navy, on long-range munitions. There will be some hard questions about how to rebalance ground forces versus the Navy versus the Air Force and long-range aviation. But I think that Russia will work very, very hard to recoup the number of long-range precision munitions it has, even though it's been holding some in reserve. I think they will work very hard to keep themselves on the naval trajectory they're on. There may be some delays. We don't know that yet. It's very hard to speculate about where those limited resources are going to go in the next 5 to 10 years. But I would say that there is no radical change one way or the other in the offing. Within some limited boundaries, we're likely to see Russian military developments in the Arctic in terms of capacity roughly develop along the same path. And we can project out with, I think, a fair amount of surety where that could be in terms of undersea assets and airborne assets. Hopefully that answers your question. I'm not sure it does, but I also want to make sure that we leave enough time. And then very quickly on the cultural significance of the Arctic, absolutely. I think that is the Russians take great national pride in the fact that the Arctic is theirs and nobody else operates in the Arctic like the Russians do. And this is our home and we live there. It's one of the great sort of cultural signifiers of Russian identity is Russia as an Arctic nation. So yes, I think that's quite vital, although that doesn't necessarily remove any space for the idea that other nations live in the Arctic as well, right? The Norwegians and the Russians, by and large, have an understanding. You know, the Russians understand that they're not the only Arctic nation with cultural heritage in the Arctic.
Thank you. When it comes to UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, I think it's can be difficult to convey that in the United States that is purely a question of politics at this point. So there are many, many arguments for acceding to UNCLOS, and they have been made by a long list of former secretaries of defense of both parties, as well as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and, you know, heads of navies, and many, many voices have been calling for the U.S. to ratify UNCLOS for many years, and it has not happened. And I think, you know, you could look at the South China Sea or sort of the broader Indo-Pacific, and there's many arguments there for UNCLOS. Certainly, issues in the Arctic also argue for the U.S. joining UNCLOS, but they have not been persuasive to date, and I don't see any changes there. The amount of political capital that would be required to ram that issue through Congress is tremendous. So it would be a very costly accomplishment. And right now we're headed into an election year, so there's no way it's going to happen. There'd have to be a very different sort of political constellation in the United States for, I think, that UNCLOS ratification to ever get over the hurdle. And in the divided system that we have, I don't see it happening. And proof of that is that the U.S. State Department has been preparing a submission for an extended continental shelf claim in the Arctic. They have worked out a theory under which that claim can be made without U.S. ratification of UNCLOS. So I think it's probably likely to be in this sort of frozen position for the foreseeable future, unfortunately. Thanks.
Great, thanks to both of you. We have busted our time limit officially, but I do have quite a few questions the gentleman in the front row here and some online. If you can bear it to hang on for 5 minutes.
Absolutely.
Those who have appointments to go to will quite understand if you want to make a swift and an elegant exit. That's perfectly understandable. But I will just wrap up one or two interesting questions. First, gentleman.
Yes, thank you. Johnny King, General Atomics. Just wondered, you did say the Arctic is a vast region. Do we have a good understanding and awareness of what's going on? It's a very difficult environment to get to. I just wondered if you really thought that we had a good, clear picture of everything that's going on there.
Great. We have a question online from Miguel Oliveira, and it's a hardy perennial in many ways, the icebreaker gap. A lot of people talk about it. How important is it? Do either of you think in terms of issues around deterrence and attempts to assert legality and presence in the Arctic? And a final one, I think, particularly for Becca, from Katerina Kurtisova. You talked in response to Nicholas's question about the difficult mechanics of some of the other institutions in terms of reviving any cooperation. But to go back to the Arctic Council, is there still room for Arctic exceptionalism in the Arctic Council in terms of that being a mechanism for reviving some kind of engagement, or is the fact that it's as she says, as she understands it, it's a consensus body? Does that present an insuperable hurdle there? So the domain awareness issue, the icebreaker gap, and the Arctic Council, where to with that?
Okay. How do you want to?
I'll do the domain awareness and be very quick. So thank you for that question. It's a very good one. We like to think that we have tremendous domain awareness wherever we go on planet Earth. The Arctic is one of those places that I don't think we do. While we are able to, in general, I think, understand broadly conditions in the Arctic, and with some, depending on the area, I think with some specificity, maintaining that domain awareness is incredibly difficult. There are probably plenty of people in this room who understand orbital mechanics better than I do, but satellites often, especially those in a low Earth orbit, are working on funny angles in the Arctic. Coverage is less clear. Communications is far more difficult. Satellite communications is far more difficult in the Arctic. So from a military perspective, it can become rather difficult to maintain a full-time domain awareness of what's happening. And I think that becomes especially true in areas of lowered military priority. It may be true. I don't want to get into the specifics of U.S. intelligence, for example, of Russian Arctic bases, especially in the Barents Sea. But I think that in terms of, we all have to prioritize. We can't be all places at once, and those limited resources that are capable of collecting on particular areas, I think, do so. But our ability to maintain that awareness full time is limited.
Thank you. So the icebreaker gap, the idea that the United States is losing some sort of race in the Arctic, and that its loss can be measured in the number of icebreakers Russia has versus the number of icebreakers the United States has, is this sort of hardy chestnut that will not go away. And it doesn't hold up to scrutiny because there's two measures, right? First of all, if you look at the Russian coastline in the Arctic, they have an enormous, 50% of the coastline in the Arctic is Russian. The United States has Alaskan coastline and does not need to break ice along all of the Alaskan coastline. So there's just a small portion of coastline in northern Alaska where we would need icebreaker services. So we're not comparing the same sort of demand signal, and also Russian icebreakers are operated by Rosatomflot and are largely put to commercial purposes. So they are there to keep shipping running on the Northern Sea Route, and the U.S. Coast Guard icebreakers do not have a commercial mission. So we're not comparing the same. We're not comparing the same, area of responsibility nor the same mission set. And on the U.S. side, there is a much narrower area of responsibility and narrower mission set. So the U.S. will never have as many icebreakers as Russia, nor should it. That being said, the United States does need more icebreakers. The US Coast Guard needs icebreakers to conduct its 11 statutory missions in the Arctic, including domain awareness, national defense, fisheries, search and rescue, interdiction of all types of illegal activities. The US has struggled to recap its icebreaker fleet for decades now, and it is an urgent national priority, and that is underscored in the NSAR, in a lot of statements. We're expecting a new polar security cutter to be delivered to the US Coast Guard probably towards the end of this decade. There have been some holdups associated with the pandemic and associated sort of supply chain disruptions. The sale of the shipyard that was building the icebreaker has sort of pushed the timelines back, but we're expecting some PSCs to hit the water by the end of the decade, and they can't come soon enough. So it's a tremendously important issue. And I'll say, you know, another thing that we can see in the NSAR along with the icebreaker issue is this issue of domain awareness. It's common across not only the US strategy, but also other national strategies for the Arctic region. It's a shared need among Western allies in the Arctic, more domain awareness, better information and better information sharing. So I'm really glad you brought up that issue. When it comes to the sort of Arctic exceptionalism issue and the Arctic Council, I think the idea that the Arctic is a special region in the world, you know, reserved and set aside from sort of geopolitics, I think that has died. And, you know, the Arctic Council is a consensus-based organization. So far, it has been able to proceed with changes like the passover in the chairmanship and the ongoing resumption of work in the working groups because Russia has not objected. And so that mechanism, that workaround has enabled the work to continue. And I think we'll probably see more of that going forward. It's in Russia's interests for the Arctic Council to continue to function. So I think it will probably sort of not actively work to stop the Arctic Council. And I think there'll be consensus among the Arctic 7. However, how much longer that can go on without being, you know, formalized or encoded somehow, I think is a really difficult question. And it raises the prospect that at any point Russia could sort of put up its hand and stop things. But we're seeing a lot of Russian interference in other international structures like, you know, the UN Security Council and the IMO and, you know, any of the Antarctic Treaty System. You know, you go around the world and you find some sort of international body and you see Russia sort of making things difficult there. So I think in some ways we're fortunate that it has thus far not made things difficult in the Arctic Council.
Just thank you for that. One final element for me, and I introduced the phrase Arctic exceptionalism rather than the question, so my fault. Is the Arctic still exceptional in the sense that it is an area where the West will have to treat Russia differently in order to you know, be able to preserve what's needed in the region, given the trenchantness and the toughness of the messages that are supposedly being sent elsewhere?
I do think that the Arctic is, you know, if not the most, certainly on a very, very short list of the most important places to Russia in the world, for all of the reasons that we've talked about. And so I think it's an area of extreme sensitivity, and we cannot be cavalier about our policy vis-a-vis Russia in the Russian part of the Arctic. So I do think it is important that we recognize the absolute importance of it to Russian leadership and be very careful about the choices that we make. I think there's other parts of the world where we can perhaps be a little bit less careful, but I think the stakes in the Arctic are some of the highest in the world.
Yeah, I agree entirely. The Arctic is, for the Russians, a very special region, a vital region. And therefore sensitivities are much higher, much higher. And that means that from a policy perspective and from a military perspective, it means that risk is also higher. So when we do these evaluations of various options within NATO and within the United States or individual countries like the UK, I think we ought to evaluate risk differently in the Arctic. That's not to say that we shouldn't be operating in the Arctic. It's just to say that we need to be evaluating risk in a different way.
Great, thanks for indulging me on that point. I will draw down the curtain now on proceedings. I'd like to thank all of those of you who've joined us here in the room, and particularly all those who've joined online, a significant audience there. Thanks to you for engaging with your interventions. That's much appreciated. What I would now invite, particularly those in the room, to do is in the traditional way to show their appreciation for the excellent engagement that we've had from our two guests here, Rebecca Pincus and Mike Peterson. Thanks very much.